Mark Foster from Sheffield in South Yorkshire, Northern England, had the eeriest experience while cycling home one night from his local pub called the Black Horse Inn. It was 11 p.m, and although he was slightly merry, he did not consider himself drunk. He was approaching the local church called St Michael's that was situated in a quiet lane. It was a mild evening, and there was a full moon, and Mark was in good spirits, but suddenly his front wheel started to wobble just as he was approaching the gates to the church. He immediately dismounted and leaned the bike against the stone wall that surrounded the church. He looked at the bike and realised he would have to carry the bike home because he had no tools to tighten the wheel. Michael was a young man who lived with his mother, and their house was a small cottage that was situated a short distance from the church. He then picked up his bike and headed for home. But then something caught his attention in the churchyard, which made him immediately put the bike down again. He quickly shook his head as if to clear his thoughts and senses and looked again. Mark had excellent eyesight, and it was a crystal clear night when the moonlight lit up all of the surrounding countryside. He then placed both hands on the stone wall and carefully scrutinised the churchyard directly in front of him to make sure that he was not imagining things. His eyes were now gazing at a spot where a slender and graceful figure of a woman appeared to drift across the tops of the grass. The figure of the woman looked elegant and delicate, and she was no more than 6 meters away from him. He was initially unsure what he was seeing, and initially believed to be a young woman from the village choosing to flit amongst the headstones like a midsummer dance. She looked very real, but at the same time there seemed to be something otherworldly about her. What was she doing floating around the graveyard this late at night? As he continued to stare, he eventually came to the conclusion that he was looking at a ghost, which he had never ever seen in his life, but there was no other explanation. He was surrounded by fields, and in front of him was something ethereal and eerie dancing in the moonlight. She just weaved about and would occasionally linger in one area before dancing amongst the graves. Her hair was a silvery grey in the moonlight that was long and wavy, and her clothing looked transparent, and she seemed to bend this way and that way as if she were being carried along by a breeze. But there was no breeze at all. Everything was still. Suddenly she stopped at a headstone, which she swirled around and around a few times before suddenly vanishing. Up to this point Mark had been holding his breath, and when she vanished his lungs expelled a huge gasp of air. As he was watching the ghostly figure dance, he'd held his breath the whole time. His eyes were still transfixed on the grave where she disappeared, and above the grave was now a mist that he stared at for about 5 minutes. Mark did not consider himself to be superstitious in any way, but what he'd just witnessed gave him a sense that he'd just seen something sacred that was way beyond this world. All he wished for now was to be home in familiar surroundings and distance from it all. He was both shaken and haunted by what he'd observed. When he got home, was still speechless when his mother greeted him, and still in shock. He was not taking in a word of what she was saying to him. All he wanted to do was go upstairs to bed. At breakfast the following morning, Mark was still very quiet and gave his mother short replies to her questions. After breakfast, they both started work, as they owned a market garden, and it was whilst working that his mother mentioned a funeral where a local woman by the name of Megan Lipton had passed away. Mark's mother had gone to school with her, and she'd been quite a character at the time, but as an elderly woman, she'd become a recluse. Mark had remembered the woman, who was fairly thin but always had a smile for him when he saw her in the garden. His mother said that when Megan's parents had died, both her and her brother shared a cottage. When she was young, she was mischievous and full of life, but her brother Angus was mean-spirited and nasty, and discouraged any man that came to visit, and he made her life very difficult. Megan should have left home and got a life of her own, but she chose to stay as she had a good heart and felt obliged to look after her brother. Her brother was in bad health and died before he was 35, and Megan was overjoyed to be rid of him and of his controlling manner. At his funeral, people noticed how cheerful she was, as she was now free of him. Megan met a man a short time after and could finally live a life of her choosing. Mark asked whether her funeral was that day, but his mother said her funeral was yesterday, and then laughed, saying Megan would not have liked the idea of being buried in the same churchyard as her brother, but gratefully was not placed in the same grave. Then his mother confided with her son and said that when Megan's brother died, she told her that she was so happy that she could have danced around his grave in pure joy. It was at this point that Mark realised that he'd left the bike leaning against the church wall, but he also wanted to check something else. When he arrived at the churchyard, he made his way to the grave, to the exact spot where the ghostly figure had danced around before abruptly vanishing before a mist suddenly rose out of that grave. As he approached the grave, he started to shiver because the name on the grave was Angus Lipton. It was then that his mother's words came back to him when Megan said she was so happy after her brother's passing that she could have danced around his grave in pure joy. Mark felt certain that the ghost that had seen the previous night was Megan Lipton, floating and dancing around her brother's grave, which she dare not do in real life. He then looked across and could see the fresh mound of dirt where Megan Lipton had been buried the day before. Mark felt even more disturbed and forgot to pick up his bike again. Megan had chosen the very day of her funeral to dance around her mean-spirited brother's grave, just like she said she wanted to do to his mother. That Friday evening, Mark was cycling home from the pub, but instead of cycling past the churchyard, he chose to take another route, as he did not want to tempt fate and encounter the dancing ghost again.